Let's make the Carpenter's star block using the 8 at a time half square triangle method. I'm going to demonstrate this method using the template from part 5 of our Time to Bloom course. I've also put together a blog post to show you how you can make a template in any size that you like, and I've put a link to this blog post in the description. So the advantage of a paper template is that it's super accurate and will make perfect half square triangles. The paper stabilizes the fabric and prevents stretching when sewing on the bias grain, and you're not left with individual triangles to trim. This is good news because the Carpenter's star has 48 half square triangles. And a tip for printing paper templates is to find the lightest paper that you can for your home printer. So for our Time to Bloom course members, print one page and measure the test box. If it measures 1 inch, then go ahead and print out another 5 pages to make a total of 6 templates. If your page isn't printing to the correct size, I've got a blog post about this that may help, so I'll also put a link for this in the description for you. Cut out each square, cutting slightly outside the line, so we'll save the exact cutting for later. Choose 3 fabrics for the Carpenter's star. I'm using a light blue, a medium blue and a creamy grey for my background fabric. Take 2 of the light fabric squares and place them right sides together with 2 of the medium squares. Now take the background squares and place them right sides together with the remaining light and medium squares. And it's important to know with this method that the light fabric always goes on top, and you'll see why later. Now place a paper template on top of each set of fabrics. Center it so that you can see some of the fabric around the edge. Pin the paper template in place, making sure that you don't pin on the diagonal lines, as this is where we're going to sew. Set your machine up with a neutral coloured thread on the top and in the bobbin and a 1/4 inch foot. I'm using a Schmetz size 90 quilting needle. This is thicker than I usually use for piecing because it will help the paper to easily tear away. Another thing to help remove the paper is a smaller stitch length of 1.8, and I'm also moving my needle one tiny space to the right for a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've shown this tip in previous videos, and it's important to note that the needle still fits safely inside the hole of the foot. Now it's time to sew a scant 1/4 inch away from the first diagonal line. Starting with a leader, then onto a square, make sure that the edge of your 1/4 inch foot is exactly on the line. Don't rush this part, it's best to sew slow to ensure accuracy. Sew from piece to piece, chain stitching in between. Snip the thread, then turn the pieces around and sew down the other side of the line. It's up to you, you can either snip the threads to separate the pieces or keep them connected. Just do what's best for you. Now stitch a scant 1/4 inch away from both sides of the other diagonal lines. When the stitching is complete, turn the pieces to the fabric side to press. This will set the seams. Now head to the cutting mat. First trim around the outside of the square, cutting exactly on the line. Next, cut in half and then cut in quarters. Once again, cutting exactly on the lines. Now cut the diagonal lines. You can relax a little here as these cuts don't have to be as accurate. To press, open out a triangle and you'll see that the seam will automatically go towards the dark side. This is why we started with the light fabric on top. Firstly, finger press the seam. This will ensure that no tiny creases are pressed into the seam. And now press with the iron. Using scissors, cut away the excess corners. And here's a tip for removing the paper without stretching those bias seams. Tear in the middle of the paper towards the stitching line. Tear away one side and then tear away the other side. Bend the paper in the seam allowance back and you'll see that it will easily come away from the seam. Now when you measure a half square triangle, you'll see that it's a perfect 2 1/4 inches square. So go ahead and do the same to the rest of the pieces. It's a bit messy, but you'll now have 16 light/medium half square triangles, 16 light/background half square triangles, 16 medium/background half square triangles. So that's a total of 48. And I have to admit, I love even numbers. And to make the carpenter's star, you'll need an additional 16 2¼ inch background squares. Now for the fun part, let's lay out a quarter of the design. It may look a bit confusing, but there's step-by-step photos in the course notes. Now I'm laying out my pieces on my wool ironing mat because the pieces tend to cling to it and I can easily take it over to my sewing machine. So separate the pieces into rows and sew the rows together with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sew slow and keep your seam allowance consistent, using a tailor's awl to hold the seams flat where necessary. I like to sew the pieces together in pairs first, and then I'll join those pairs together to make the complete row. Now it might look a bit confusing, but just make sure that the triangles are facing in the correct direction before you go to sew. Double check everything and you shouldn't have any problems. So press the seams in each row in opposite directions using the 3-step pressing technique. So the seams in the top row are going to the right, second row are going to the left, third row going to the right, and the fourth row going to the left. Now when I go to join the rows together, because the seams are facing in opposite directions, they'll nest, and that makes it a lot easier to align the seams. So now it's time to join the rows together. You can align those seams with either the pin trick or you can glue baste, which is what I'm going to do. So when I glue baste, I just use my ruler on top of my ironing mat to make sure that I don't get glue on my ironing mat. And I just make sure that the glue is just tiny little dabs of glue within the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And another tip is when you're gluing or pinning the pieces together, if you find that there's a section or a square that's going to be a little bit, it seems a bit loose, when you sew with that loose piece underneath, so the top smaller piece will ease that in as you sew. So see how this section is a little bit loose here? So when I go to sew, I'm going to put that on the underneath and my top piece will ease that in, and I shouldn't get any little puckers there. So go ahead and sew the other 2 rows together in the same way. So before I join these 2 pieces together, I'm going to press both seams in a downwards direction. Now sew the rows together. As the seams are pressed in opposite directions, they will nest. So align them with the pin trick as shown in part 1, or glue base them, which is what I like to do.
Did it turn out good?
It's not too bad. I've got something funny going on here, but I'm happy with that. No one's going to notice. So go ahead and make the other quarters of the block in the same way, and it's really important to make sure that you press them all in the same way too. Stack all 4 blocks on top of each other before laying them out to form the star. So go ahead and join the top 2 blocks together and join the bottom 2 blocks together. And just like magic, all seams are facing in the opposite direction, so they'll nest when the 4 sections of the block are sewn together. Wow, this block looks absolutely amazing. Now, all we have to do is join the top 2 squares together and then the bottom 2 squares together, and it's just in the same way. The seams are facing in opposite directions, so it's just a matter of nesting those seams and lining them up with a pin or glue basting, which is what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to get those joined and then I'll show you the middle row. Okay, now let's press these seams in opposite directions. So let's do the top one to the right and then we'll do the bottom seam to the left. Okay, so now let's sew the top and the bottom of the block together. Okay, so sometimes when I'm sewing, my machine wants to kick that bottom seam up. So I've just always got to remember to hold it really flat before I go to sew over it. So I'm just going to start again here. And let's go again. I've got to make sure that it really is sitting flat. There we go, I've got it, and sometimes I just need to give it a little helping hand from behind. So you'll see that there's some fairly bulky seams in this block, and that's because we have all of these seams meeting in the one place. So the bulkiest seam of all is this center seam. So I'm going to use a technique that's called spinning a seam, and that's going to flatten the seam out so that it's not so thick there. So to do this, just do this on the center seam. So where we have our stitching line here, we're just going to unpick. So we're basically unpicking the vertical stitching line. We're just going to unpick that back to the horizontal stitching line. Just like that. Now the next thing is to open the work out, and the way I do this is I first of all just start by opening that seam out. It can be a little bit tricky because we have glue basted, but I've got it open. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to press one side of the seam up, and then I'm going to bring the other side down. So when I do that, I can just unpick probably a little bit more there. I think I've got a bit of glue holding that there. It's a bit of a fiddle, but it is worth it just to flatten that seam out. I haven't done a great job of this, but basically what happens is it's like it forms like another little pinwheel in the center, and I think I've got that. Yeah, I've got a bit of a frayed pinwheel, but this seam's going up, this seam's going down, and it's called spinning a seam because we've taken that one up, that one down, and then you'll see that it's really not as bulky in the center. And I'm sorry about that, it's probably not the best seam I've ever spun. But so this seam is now going to go up, and this seam's going to go down. I'm just giving that a little press, but I'll turn that over to the front. And there's my seam in the middle. That's quite nice and flat. And I can now press this side, going down, and this side going up. And see, it's not as bulky. And there's my spun seam, which is a little bit frayed. Sorry about that. So here's our finished Carpenter's style block. The block should measure 14.5 inches square. And if you're joining in with our Time to Bloom course, you know that we're sewing the borders on around the edge. So if your block comes up a little bit small, the borders are going to make up for any loss of size. So all I have to do now is sew my borders on, finish the quilting, and just have to finish my applique block. So this is a beautiful lady beetle design designed by Laura, which is the bonus applique block for the course. So I'm going to keep stitching, and Laura will show the completed blocks in the video at the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.